This is the Mineral Rights Podcast, episode number 3. Today we're talking about how to calculate your net revenue interest in a well in 3 simple steps. So let's go.
Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hey everybody, thank you again for joining me in this episode of the Mineral Rights Podcast. If this is your first time listening, then welcome. And again, if you find this information useful, please subscribe on whatever site or device you're using to listen to the show. So today we're going to talk about royalty interest and net revenue interest and how to estimate your royalty check, which is an exciting topic when you talk about potentially getting paid for a well that's getting drilled on your property. And I'm going to walk you through the simple steps that you need and the information that you'll need to have in order to do this. But before we get into that, I want to encourage you to check out the show notes for today's episode. This is because I'm going to be discussing a few terms that are complex in nature and doing some math, and so it always helps to see a visual representation of that if you're like me. You can find the show notes at mineralrightspodcast.com/3 for this episode. And I want to start by saying that calculating your net revenue interest in a well is pretty straightforward, and you just need to have 3 key pieces of information to get started. In fact, it's so simple that once you have these key pieces of information, it should take you less than 5 minutes to actually know what your net revenue interest in that well is. This is important because this way you can verify that any division orders you receive in the mail for those wells that are getting drilled on your property are correct, and that you can make sure that you're getting paid what you deserve. And on that division order, you'll see a decimal interest, and that number represents the net revenue interest that you own in that particular well. And if you have more than one well, they'll have an exhibit there usually, and it'll list out each well and what your interest is and the type of interest. If you don't know what a division order is and like to find out more, I'll have a few links in the show notes where you can go and understand each section and what it means and how to read it. So to get started with calculating your net revenue interest, there are really 3 key pieces of information and 3 steps, and these can be done in any order, but I'll just go through them in a logical sequence, and then from there you can use that to calculate your own net revenue interest. If you'd like to follow along, here are the 3 items. I'll go over them again so you can take notes, and if you're driving or not able to have a pen and pencil handy, then again go to the show notes and you can see all this in action. The first is an understanding of the net mineral acres, or NMA. So the first is net mineral acres. The second is the size of the spacing unit, or the drilling spacing unit, where the well is located. This is sometimes abbreviated as a DSU. So the second, again, is drilling spacing unit, or DSU. And the last item is the royalty rate. The last item, again, it's your royalty rate, and that can be found on your oil and gas lease. And these 3 items are usually fairly easy to find. And if you don't have them handy, you don't know what your net mineral acres, or you don't know the size of the drilling spacing unit, I'll tell you where you can find this information. For the purposes of this podcast and of the show notes and the examples, we'll assume that this royalty is not burdened by an NPRI, and so that just keeps it a little bit easier to follow. Throughout the podcast, I'm just going to be referring to an example from North Dakota for illustrative purposes, but this works with any land that you have, regardless of where it's located. So before we get into the details, I'll go through and define each term first, and then work the example. Okay, so net mineral acres. And this term refers to the net acreage of the mineral rights that are owned. And if you remember back to the previous episode, we talked briefly about legal description. And legal descriptions rear their ugly head again And in order to find out how many net mineral acres you own, you need to first start by understanding the legal description, and that's usually where that'll be described. So if you know the decimal interest in your mineral tract, then you have the legal description, you can calculate the net acres owned. And I'm not going to go through the specific location, the section, township, range on the podcast. That information's in the show notes. You can get an example of where one particular lot or tract is located that I'm working. But in this example, the gross acreage for this tract of land is 640 acres. So it's a one section of land. And let's assume that we own 1/40th interest in this tract. So this decimal interest, that's 2.5% or 2.5% in 640 acres. So the gross acres, you'll hear that term again, that's the overall surface area of that tract. And then your interest is the percentage of that. Now to get the net acreage or the net mineral acres, it's pretty simple. All we do is multiply the gross acreage by your fractional ownership of that or decimal interest in that tract. In our case, it's 2.5% times 640 acres, and that yields 16 net acres. So the number 16 is the first number that we'll need in calculating that NRI. And so we have the NMA or the net mineral acres now is 16. If you don't know that decimal interest or the fraction of ownership, you'll find that by performing a title search. A landman or a lawyer will be able to get that information for you. And in a title search, that landman will search the county records and note each transfer of ownership back in time. And then as part of the report that you'll get, they'll indicate on there what the decimal interest is in the acreage and your estimation of the net mineral acres. So if you don't know the net mineral acres, that title search will yield that, and then you can use that piece of information to calculate your NRI. Now what's next? The second piece of information we mentioned was the size of the drilling spacing unit, or DSU. And this information is often found in your state's Oil and Gas Commission website. For the North Dakota example that I mentioned, we went to the North Dakota Industrial Commission, Department of Mineral Resources, Oil and Gas Division website. That's a mouthful, but there's a link in the show notes if you happen to live in North Dakota or if you own minerals in North Dakota and want to look there. The GIS map server online shows the drilling spacing units in a layer that you can turn on, and I'm not going to go into how to do that today. You can look on the website, and there's some information on how to turn on and off different layers and how to display that on the map. What you first need to do is locate that tract or locate the section where your minerals are on the map, and then you can turn on that layer, and then it'll show you the size of that drilling spacing unit. And in this case, let's assume that we got wind of a horizontal Bakken well that is being drilled in our section, and this section is part of a 1,280 acre DSU, so a two-section large DSU. When you look at a drilling spacing unit, basically what happens is you're pooled with the other mineral owners within that DSU so that you share in the proportional amount of production based on the amount of net mineral acres you own in that DSU. So in this case, the second item that we have, the number that we need is 1,280, and that's 1,280 acres for the size of our DSU in this example. So the final item we're going to get into is the royalty rate. And for this, we'll need a copy of our lease. If you happen to have that, if you were the one that was fortunate enough to sign that and understand what the royalty rate is, that's just going through your files and pulling that out and looking at it. If you don't have it, what you'll need to do is do a search on your county clerk and recorder's website or go down to the county clerk's office to pull that out. And what you would need to do is search by the location, and you can see in there where a lease was recorded on your land. If that sounds daunting, again, you can hire the services of a landman to do that for you. If you happen to have that information online, it's really pretty easy. It's worth giving it a shot yourself first before you do hire a landman. But again, if that's something that you're not comfortable doing, or you want to make sure that you get the right information, that would be the route to go, is again to have the landman, while they're there pulling the chain of title, they can get copies of the lease for you. Now, once you have that lease, you go into the first page, and there's a statement on that first page that'll say something to this effect. It'll say, the lessee shall deliver to the credit of the lessor as royalty free of cost into the tanks or in the pipeline of the leased premises to which lessee may connect its wells equal 15%. In this case, that's our royalty rate. It may show a fraction there, 1/8 you'll see, or 1/5, and you just convert that down to what decimal that represents. So that's where you would look, and there'll be a statement on that with respect to oil and then gas, and usually those are the same. So in this case, it's part of all oil produced and saved from the leased premises, and on another paragraph or just below that, it'll show you the percentage for gas. So again, in this example, our lease has a 15% royalty rate. This is your royalty rate that you'll need to calculate the net revenue interest, and that's the last number you'll need. All right, so now we can do some math. It's a real easy calculation that we have to do here. The first step is we take the net mineral acres that we own and divide that by the size of our drilling spacing unit acres. In our example, we have 16 net mineral acres, and the DSU size is 1,280 acres. So 16 divided by 1,280. Get that result, and then multiply that by your royalty rate. And that, in our case, is 15%, or 0.15. So again, we'll take the net mineral acres, divide it by the DSU size, and then multiply that by our royalty rate. And that will give us our net revenue interest. And going back to the division order that I mentioned earlier, that's the interest, the decimal interest number that you'll see on the division order, and those should match. If that doesn't match, you'll need to go back and check your calculations and make sure that you're using the right information. And if you're sure or fairly certain that you're using the right information, that's where you go back to the operator who sent you the division order, and then you can challenge that interest and make sure that it's correct. For our example, the number that we get is 0.001875. So 16 divided by 1280 times 0.15 is 0.001875, which means that we'll receive 0.1875% of any oil and gas sold on this new Bakken well that is going to be drilled. And we'll put it in perspective and go through on how to actually estimate your royalty check. And this will give you a feel for what does this mean in dollars and cents. So if we look at the production numbers, and most state oil and gas commission websites will have a section on there where you can look at nearby wells on that GIS interface, on that map interface. You can look at the well, and then they'll have a link to look at the production from that well. So the way to find this information, if you haven't already gotten royalty checked and seen the production numbers, or haven't heard about what the production is going to be, and just waiting for that check to come, and so you can understand what's the amount of that check, you go to that State Oil and Gas Commission website. It'll have that information. And often it's not up to date. It's not updated on a daily basis. It's a monthly update, and it may lag a couple of months. So if you're looking at it in May, it's May right now, you may only find February or March production numbers available. So if the well just went online, it's likely that production number won't be available on the state website, but you can use other ways to find that information. In any case, let's say that we know by looking around the other wells that are drilled in the Bakken near our particular tract in this example appear to average around 10,000 barrels of oil produced in the first 3 months. So let's assume, for the sake of this example, that our new well is going to average this as well. And a disclaimer here, when a new well comes online, there's going to be a range where that well will fit. There's a high and there's a low, and the more data points you look around your particular tract, you'll get a better understanding of sort of the average initial production rate, and that's a good number to use. So if you look at fairly large sampling of the various sections around where your tract is. Look at the similar types of wells and the similar formation. Average out those initial production rates. That'll give you a rough example of what to expect when you actually get that check. Again, let's assume our example well averages 10,000 barrels of oil produced in the first 3 months. And let's say that the price of Bakken crude is $50 a barrel. What we would expect to get over that 3-month period, the total amount of the royalty for the oil production only in this case would be 10,000 barrels times $50 a barrel times our net revenue interest number that we came up with. And I'll go through that again a little bit slower so you can follow along. So 10,000 barrels times $50 per barrel times 0.001875. And if I plug it into the calculator, I'll get $937.50. So that's the approximate amount that we should expect to see in those royalty checks, or that royalty check for that 3-month period. So you can look at this number, and when you get that royalty check, if it's significantly different than that, then you can understand that something might be up and you need to go and dig a little bit deeper. Again, the price of oil fluctuates on a daily basis. The operator may or may not hedge production, so that means they may buy futures contracts and actually lock in the production, a certain percentage of production at a certain dollar amount, and then the rest may be sold based on the spot price that's effective the day that they sell that oil. So this will be an average number you'll see on the check stub. And if you're in a particular basin, like the Bakken is a good example, the Williston Basin, there's a significant deduct. So if you see the price of West Texas Intermediate, WTI, it may be at $60 a barrel, whereas the amount that you're actually getting in the Bakken could be $50. So there's a deduct, or a price differential, they call it, and that is due to additional cost that operators have in transporting or in processing the crude if it's got nasty stuff in it that they need to take out and be able to sell it to a refinery. This gives you a feel for how to calculate how much you can expect to get in your royalty check, and use it as a basis for making sure that you're getting paid what you deserve. And if you have a gas well, or if this well is going to produce both oil and gas, you would do the same things that I just did. All of the net revenue interest numbers would be the same, assuming you have your royalty rates the same for the gas production. And then you would just plug in what the gross volume is and the price for that gas, and that'll give you a expectation of what you'll get from the point of view of the gas royalty. So this isn't too bad, if we look back at this example, $937, and if it was money we weren't budgeting for, not too bad for income that you probably weren't expecting to receive. And if you want to get more detailed, if you have a significant mineral estate that you are dealing with, multiple horizontal wells that are getting drilled, I would highly recommend hiring the services of a petroleum engineer to give you an estimate of what the reserves are and do a proper production forecast that will give you a really more accurate feel for what the production should be. And then again, with the landman, if you have a significant number of acres, then hire a landman to make sure that there might not be something else out there that you don't know about. You could actually own more or less on that flip side of that. But they'll be able to tell you what you own and give you a little bit higher degree of certainty around what to expect. Now, if you're like me and you want the shortcut and want the tool to be able to do this, I created a free royalty calculator worksheet that you can use to calculate your own NRI and to estimate your own royalty payments. So I'll have a link in the show notes for that. Go to mineralrightspodcast.com/3. Okay, to wrap up, I want to sincerely thank you again for joining me on the Mineral Rights Podcast, and I truly hope that this was useful information for you and that'll help you make sure that you're getting paid what you deserve when it comes to royalty checks. And in order to keep this moving along and to help provide some more useful information for you in future episodes, please click on the subscribe button on whatever site or device you're using to listen to this. And this type of support will allow the show to gain the recognition it needs to reach as many other mineral and royalty owners as possible. And if you have neighbors that are also facing some of the same issues, please share the show with them, and hopefully it'll help them out as well. And in turn, we'll be able to share this knowledge and experience with other mineral owners. So stay tuned, because the next episode is going to be really useful in understanding more about severance taxes. And I'll cover that and what to expect when you get that royalty check. You'll see a line item on there for severance tax. And I'm going to cover why that tax is deducted, and also some little known tax credits that are out there as it relates to severance tax. So if you have any suggestions or feedback on this podcast, please shoot me an email at feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com. Or if you prefer to call and leave a voice message, you can do that at 720-580-2088. Thanks again. See you next time.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.